Lavinia Beck was 28, and the town of Redemption, Colorado, was about to corner her between the flour barrels and the salt pork. She was a woman who carried her substance without apology, but the world had a way of demanding one. From the corner of his eye, a cowboy named Tate Foley watched from the doorway of the hardware store, his stillness a stark contrast to the gathering storm on Main Street. He'd lost his own voice to grief years ago, and hadn't spoken a word since. But what no one in that street knew, least of all Lavinia, was that the silent man leaning on the post had already decided something, and his silence was about to become the loudest thing the town had ever heard. The life they were about to build would be a quiet one, measured in warm plates and mended seams, proving that the truest things are rarely said aloud. Stay close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The cruelty began, as it often did, with a voice pitched to Carrie. "Well now, Martha, look what the cat's dragged in." It was Beatrice Hemlock, a woman whose face was a permanent pinch of disapproval. She stood with Martha Gable by the bins of dried beans, their shopping baskets held like shields. Lavinia Beck did not turn. She kept her attention on the sacks of flour, calculating what she could afford. She had been in Redemption for 3 weeks, living in a small rented room behind the bakery, taking in mending. It was a solitary life, and she had learned long ago that the best way to navigate towns like this was to make herself as small as possible. It was a difficult task for a woman built on generous lines, with a solid frame and a presence that seemed to gather light. "I do declare," Martha said, her voice rising to fill the space of the general store. "You'd think a woman of her build would have had her fill." A few other shoppers paused. A man weighing out nails glanced over, then quickly back at his work. The storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, began polishing a spot on the counter that was already clean. This was women's business, and it was cruel. Lavinia's shoulders tightened, but she did not falter. She reached for a smaller sack of flour, the 10-pound one. Her money was dear, and her appetite, despite their insinuations, was modest. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame so hot it felt like a fever. She had felt it before, in other towns, at other markets. It was the familiar burn of being seen not as a person, but as a spectacle. "She's after the sugar now," Beatrice whispered, a stage whisper meant for the entire audience. "Got a sweet tooth, I imagine. It's always the way." Lavinia's hand, which had been hovering over the sugar barrel, drew back as if stung. She straightened her spine, her chin lifting a fraction. Her mother had taught her that. "Stand tall, Lavinia. Let them see your spine is made of good steel." She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over them without landing. Her expression was placid, a carefully constructed mask of indifference she had perfected over years of similar ambushes. She would not give them the satisfaction of a tear or a sharp retort. Her silence was her only armor. She held her nearly empty basket in one hand, her worn purse in the other. Her knuckles were white, the only sign of the tremor that ran through her. She would simply leave. She would go without the flour, without the sugar. She would make do with the potatoes and onions she had in her room. She had made do with less. She took a step toward the door, a slow, deliberate movement. The air in the store was thick with watching, with the smug satisfaction of the two women and the uneasy complicity of the others. Every eye was on her, waiting for her to break. From his vantage point, Tate Foley saw it all. He had been about to go back into the hardware store for the hinges he'd forgotten. But the tone of Martha Gable's voice had stopped him. He knew that tone. It was the sound of a hawk circling. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, his hat pulled low, and watched. He saw the woman, he didn't know her name, flinch, just a little, a tightening around her eyes that no one else would have noticed. He saw her hand retreat from the sugar barrel. He saw the color stain her cheeks and the heroic effort she made to keep her face a calm, unreadable mask. He'd seen her in town before. She was new. She walked with a purpose that suggested she had nowhere to go but forward. She carried a mending basket sometimes, a sign of her trade. She was alone. He knew what that looked like. He knew what it felt like. He watched as she turned, her back straight as a fence post. He saw the quiet dignity in the set of her shoulders, a dignity that shamed the cackling women by the bean bins. Most people, when cornered, either fought back with useless anger or crumbled. This woman did neither. She simply endured, absorbing the cruelty and refusing to be diminished by it. Something in him, a part of him that had been sleeping for 4 long years, recognized the quality of her strength. It was a quiet strength, like his own. He saw the single, worn bag she carried, the careful way she held her purse, the unmistakable air of a person who had learned to depend on no one but herself. He had seen men break in the high country with more support than she had in that store. And in that moment, without a single word, without a conscious thought, he decided. He didn't know what he was deciding. Not yet. He only knew that the sight of her standing alone in a sea of malice was something he would not allow. The crowd of shoppers parted for Lavinia as she walked toward the door, their averted eyes a confession of their cowardice. She was almost there, almost to the dusty sunlight of the street, when her foot caught on an uneven floorboard. Her basket, containing only a small parcel of thread and a bar of soap, tipped from her grasp. The soap skittered under a counter. The thread rolled in a slow, heartbreaking circle in the dust. It was a small thing, but it was the final indignity. The dam of her composure threatened to break. Before she could even bend to retrieve her things, a shadow fell over her. Tate Foley had pushed himself off the doorframe. He moved without hurry, his worn boots making almost no sound on the wooden floor. He walked past the gawking women, past the storekeeper, and stopped beside Lavinia. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He simply bent down, his movements economical and sure, and picked up the spool of thread. He found the bar of soap, dusted it off with his thumb, and placed both items carefully back into her basket. Then he straightened up and stood beside her, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the far wall, a silent sentinel. The air in the store shifted. His silence was more powerful than any shout. It was a judgment, and the whole town felt it. The silence in the general store stretched, thick and heavy. Martha and Beatrice, who had been primed for more sport, suddenly found their mouths dry. Tate Foley was not a man you crossed. He was quiet, yes, but there was a weight to him, a history of sorrow that the town respected and feared in equal measure. For him to intervene, even silently, was an event. He didn't offer Lavinia his arm. He didn't say a comforting word. He simply took her basket from her unresisting fingers and walked out of the store. The screen door slammed softly behind him. For a moment, Lavinia remained frozen, caught between the hostile quiet inside and the unknown quiet of the man outside. Then, drawing a breath that felt like her first in an hour, she followed him. He was waiting by a sturdy wagon hitched to a single, steady-looking mare. He placed her basket on the wagon seat and turned to her. The afternoon sun lit the lines around his eyes. They were kind eyes, she noticed, though they were filled with a deep, abiding sadness. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a small, worn slate and a nub of chalk. His movements were practiced, familiar. With a few swift strokes he wrote, "I need a housekeeper. My children need minding. Room and board. Until you find your footing." The offer was as plain and unadorned as the man himself. There was no pity in it, no charity. It was a transaction, a job. He was not rescuing her. He was proposing a practical arrangement. Lavinia read the words, then looked up at his face. He met her gaze directly, his expression unwavering. He was not asking. He was stating a fact, a need he had that she could fill. It was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her all day. She thought of her small, lonely room, of the dwindling coins in her purse, of the unending effort of being invisible and self-sufficient. She thought of the sneering faces in the store. Here was an escape, if only a temporary one. A port in a storm. And there was something in this man's stillness that felt safer than any place she had ever been. "I can cook," she said, her voice a little unsteady but clear, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." He nodded once, a short, sharp gesture of confirmation. He wiped the slate clean with the heel of his hand and wrote again. "My boy is Sam. He's 10. The girl is Lily. She's 5. He gestured to the wagon. It was an invitation. She took a moment, her mind racing. To go with a strange man, a silent one at that, to a place she did not know. It was a risk. But staying in Redemption, in that room where the walls felt like they were closing in, felt like a greater one. She looked at his hands. They were strong, calloused, capable. They were the hands of a man who worked. They were the hands that had gently picked up her fallen thread. She made her decision. "I'll need to get my things from my room behind the bakery." He nodded again, then climbed onto the wagon seat and held out a hand to help her up. His grip was firm and impersonal. She settled herself, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Without another gesture, he clicked his tongue, and the mare started forward, pulling the wagon down the dusty street, away from the watching eyes of the town. The ride to his ranch was quiet, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the mare's hooves. Tate Foley's property was a few miles out of town, nestled against a low rise of hills. The house was simple, a sturdy log and clapboard structure with a wide porch. It was an orderly place. The woodpile was neatly stacked, the fences were mended, and there wasn't a tool out of place. But it was a house that held its breath. It was clean, but lacked warmth. It was a space that was maintained, not lived in. He led her inside. The main room was dominated by a large stone hearth, swept clean. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs stood in the center. To one side was the kitchen area, with a cast-iron stove and shelves holding a spare collection of plates and tins. It was a man's house, run with efficiency but without comfort. 2 children were sitting at the table, staring down at their books. The boy, Sam, looked up as they entered, his face a miniature mask of suspicion. He had his father's serious eyes. The little girl, Lily, peeked out from behind her brother's arm, her expression one of wide-eyed curiosity. Tate touched the boy's shoulder gently. Sam flinched, but didn't pull away. Tate pointed to Lavinia, then to himself, then made a gesture that seemed to encompass the entire house. The message was clear enough. She will be staying. She will be keeping the house. Sam's gaze flickered to Lavinia, sharp and assessing, before he looked back down at his book, his shoulders set in a line of stubborn resistance. Lily, however, offered a small, shy smile. Tate then led Lavinia to a room at the back of the house. It was small and spare, containing a narrow cot with a neatly folded blanket, a small washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out onto the winter pasture. It had its own door to the outside. The separation was clear, the boundaries unspoken but absolute. It was a room for an employee, not a guest. "This will be fine," Lavinia said, her voice sounding loud in the quiet house. He nodded and left her, closing the door softly behind him. Lavinia stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. She set her mending basket down on the floor beside the cot, the familiar weight of it a small anchor in this new uncertain world. She ran a hand over the rough wool of the blanket. It was clean. Everything was clean. Later, as she moved into the kitchen to assess the pantry, she noticed it. In a corner of the main room, set apart from the rest of the furniture, was a rocking chair. It was made of dark, polished wood, and draped over its back was a shawl. In the seat of the chair rested a piece of knitting, the needles still stuck through a half-finished row of a tiny baby sweater. The yarn, a pale yellow, trailed into a basket on the floor. It was an altar, a shrine to a ghost. No one had touched it. The dust lay thick on the yarn basket, but the chair itself was clean, as if wiped by a reverent hand. This was the source of the silence in the house, the heart of the sorrow in the man's eyes. Lavinia understood. She knew, without being told, that this chair was a place she must never go, a thing she must never touch. The terms of her arrangement were simple. She was here to work, to fill the empty spaces with food and warmth, but she was not here to replace what had been lost. The arrangement began, and with it, the small acts. Life in Tate Foley's house settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. There were no grand pronouncements, no stated expectations. There was only the quiet, steady cadence of work. Lavinia rose before the sun, her internal clock set by years of habit. But she always found the fire in the main room's hearth already built, the embers glowing warmly in the pre-dawn dark. A stack of freshly split wood would be waiting in the box beside it. Tate would be gone by then, already out in the barn, his chores begun. On the stove, a pot of coffee would be brewing, left there for her. He never mentioned it. She never thanked him. It was simply there, a silent offering, a cup of warmth against the chill. In return, she brought the house to life. The scent of baking bread, something the children had likely not smelled in years, began to fill the kitchen. She found the pantry sparsely stocked, but organized. She made do. She stretched the flour with cornmeal, made hearty stews from salted pork and the last of the garden's root vegetables. Tate would come in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, and a hot meal would be waiting on the table. If he was late from mending a fence line on the far side of the property, she kept a plate for him on the warming shelf of the stove. He never asked her to. She never told him she had. When he finally came in, long after the children were asleep, he would find it there. And he would eat at the quiet table alone, the food still warm. Her mending basket, which had sat untouched for the first few days, was brought out. She started with the children's clothes. A patch on the knee of Sam's trousers, stitched so neatly it was almost invisible. A new ribbon for the frayed cuff of Lily's dress. Then, one evening, she saw Tate's work jacket slung over a chair, a long tear in the sleeve where it had caught on barbed wire. The next morning, the jacket was back on its peg by the door, the sleeve stitched closed, the thread a perfect match to the worn fabric. He put the jacket on, his fingers brushing over the seam. His eyes flickered toward her as she kneaded bread at the kitchen table, but he said nothing. His acknowledgement was in the way he wore the jacket, the tear no longer catching the wind. He noticed the porch step was loose. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry, she heard the sound of a hammer. When she came back in, the step was solid and sure beneath her foot. He'd used new nails. He was in the barn sharpening an axe, as if nothing had happened. These gestures became their language. It was a conversation held in fixed steps and warm plates, in mended seams and coffee left on a counter. It was a language of pure utility, stripped of sentiment, yet it built something stronger than words. It built reliance. Trust. She learned the sound of his boots on the porch and knew if he was tired or if the work had gone well. He learned that the smell of cinnamon meant she had found a small bag of it tucked away and was making a special treat for the children. They moved around each other in the small space of the house with a quiet, practiced grace, two solitary people learning the shape of another's presence. And neither of them, not for a moment, spoke of what was happening. They just let the small acts accumulate, like snowdrifts against a cabin wall, building a shelter against the cold. The children were the first to thaw. Lily, open-hearted and starved for a mother's softness, was Lavinia's shadow from the start. She would trail behind her in the kitchen, chattering about a bird she saw or a dream she'd had. She would bring Lavinia treasures, a smooth gray stone, a fallen feather, a wildflower plucked from the pasture. Lavinia would accept them with a solemnity that honored the gift, placing the stone on the windowsill or tucking the feather into the band of her apron. One afternoon, as Lavinia sat near the fire, darning one of Sam's socks, Lily climbed into her lap. It was a tentative, questioning movement. Lavinia's hands stilled over her work. She was not used to the weight of a child. Lily snuggled against her, her small head finding the curve of Lavinia's shoulder, and let out a contented sigh. After a long moment of silence, a small voice, soft and clear as a bell, drifted up. "Mama?" The word fell into the quiet room and hung there, shimmering. Sam, who was carving a piece of wood by the door, went rigid. His knife stilled. From the corner of her eye, Lavinia saw Tate in the doorway to the barn, his hand frozen on the latch. He had heard it. Everyone had. A painful silence descended. Lavinia's heart ached. She gently smoothed Lily's hair. "I'm Lavinia, sweet girl," she said, her voice thick. "You had a mama. A wonderful mama." She glanced toward the rocking chair in the corner, the silent shrine. Lily just snuggled closer. "You smell like bread," she murmured and fell asleep. The moment passed, but the word remained, an echo in the house. Sam was a harder fortress to breach. He was his father's son, watchful and silent, and fiercely loyal to the memory of his mother. He saw Lavinia as an interloper, a stranger in his mother's kitchen. He spoke to her only when necessary, his answers clipped and grudging. Lavinia did not push. She simply ensured his shirts were clean, his lunches were packed, and that there was always an extra biscuit for him, because she'd noticed he always took two. One day, he was helping his father split wood when the axe slipped. It wasn't a bad cut, but a long, nasty splinter of wood drove deep into the palm of his hand. He came into the house, pale and biting his lip, trying not to cry. Tate followed, his face tight with worry. He tried to get the splinter out with the point of his knife, but Sam, terrified, yanked his hand away. "Don't," he cried. "It hurts." Lavinia put down the potatoes she was peeling. "Let me see, Sam," she said, her voice calm and low. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and distrust. "I'll be gentle," she promised. Hesitantly, he held out his hand. She washed it carefully in a basin of warm water, her touch incredibly soft. Then, taking a clean needle from her mending basket and a pair of tweezers, she worked with a surgeon's focus. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. Tate watched, his own large hands clenched at his sides, useless. In a few moments, she had eased the splinter out. She cleaned the wound again and wrapped it in a clean strip of cloth. Sam stared at his bandaged hand, then up at her. He didn't say thank you. But that evening, when he came to the table for supper, he pushed the bowl of biscuits toward her first. It was the beginning of a truce. The town, too, began to warm. The parson, making his rounds, stopped by. He saw the clean house, the well-fed children, the quiet order. He saw Lily laughing. He left with a nod of approval to Tate. A woman from a neighboring ranch, hearing of Lavinia's skill with a needle, brought a complex dress to be altered. Lavinia's usefulness was becoming known, a currency that bought her a fragile kind of acceptance. She knew it was not the same as being known, but for now, it was enough. The first crack in the surface of their arrangement came on a bitter night in late autumn. A freezing rain had been falling since noon, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. Tate was out, having ridden to check on a newborn calf in the far pasture. The children were long asleep, and the house was quiet save for the drumming of the rain and the crackle of the fire. Lavinia waited. She kept the stew hot on the stove and the coffee pot full. She sat in a straight-backed chair by the hearth, her mending basket in her lap, her hands busy with one of Tate's shirts. The rhythmic pull of the needle was a comfort, a familiar motion in an unfamiliar life. As the hours passed, the warmth of the fire and the lateness of the hour worked on her. Her head began to nod, her hands slowed, then stilled. Finally, her head drooped to the side, coming to rest against the rough wood of the chair's high back. She slept. Tate came in near midnight, soaked through and bone-weary. The calf had been saved, but it had been a long, cold fight. He pushed the door open quietly, expecting a dark and silent house. Instead, he was met with the soft glow of the fire, and he saw her. She was asleep in the chair, her face peaceful in the flickering light. Her mending lay in her lap, her hands still resting on his shirt. He stopped dead in the middle of the room. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a housekeeper or a solution to a problem, but as a woman asleep by his fire, waiting for him. The house felt different with her in it. It felt full. The emptiness that had echoed in its corners for 4 years had been softened, padded by the scent of baking and the quiet industry of her hands. He stood there for a long time, just watching her breathe. He saw the faint lines of worry around her eyes, smoothed out now in sleep. He felt an urge so strong it was a physical ache, to go to her, to smooth the stray hair from her forehead. He did not. Instead, he moved with infinite care to the hearth and added a log to the fire, placing it so gently it made no sound. He then went to his own room and returned with the heavy wool blanket from his bed. He unfolded it and draped it carefully over her, tucking it around her shoulders. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, but did not wake. For a moment, his hand hovered near her face. Then he pulled it back and retreated, not to his own cold bed, but to the barn, where he spent the rest of the night on a cot in the hayloft, leaving her to the warmth she had created. The next day, a new awareness hung between them. It was unspoken, but palpable. That evening, as she was putting her mending basket away, he stopped her with a light touch on her arm. She turned, surprised. He held up his slate. The chalk scratched in the quiet room. "Where did you learn to be so steady?" It was the first question he had ever asked about her. Not about her skills, not about her needs, but about her. It was the first time anyone had wanted to know something about the person inside the capable body. She was so taken aback she couldn't speak for a moment. She looked at the words, then at his face, his questioning eyes. "You have to be," she said simply, her voice low. "When there's no one else to lean on, you learn to be your own post." He held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a profound and silent understanding. He wiped the slate clean. The unspoken question lingered in the air between them. What if you didn't have to be? The fragile peace was broken by the same voice that had shattered it before. Martha Gable saw Lavinia in town with the Foley children. She saw the way Lily's hand was tucked securely into Lavinia's, the way Sam walked beside her, no longer trailing behind with suspicion but matching her stride. She saw the change in the children, the light back in their eyes, and she twisted it into something ugly. Standing on the church steps after Sunday service, she found her audience. "It's not proper," she began, her voice carrying in the crisp air. "A woman like that, living in that poor man's house, and him unable to even speak for himself. She's taking advantage of his grief, is what she's doing." Beatrice Hemlock, ever her loyal echo, nodded vigorously, and her appetites, "It's a disgrace." What kind of example is that for those motherless children? The poison spread quickly. Redemption was a town that ran on gossip as much as it did on commerce. The warmth that had been building around Lavinia receded like a tide. The smiles she received became brief and strained. Women who had been asking for her help with sewing projects now crossed the street to avoid her. The parson's wife stopped her outside the general store and delivered a quiet, cutting lecture on the importance of appearances, framing her disapproval as Christian concern. Lavinia felt the familiar chill of isolation creep back in. The shame she had fought so hard to banish returned, heavy and suffocating. She began to withdraw. She stopped humming in the kitchen. She spoke only when the children spoke to her. She made herself smaller again, more efficient, her movements becoming brisk and impersonal. She was once again just the housekeeper, a function, a service. She was building walls around her heart, because walls were what she knew how to build. Tate noticed everything. He noticed the silence that had replaced her humming. He noticed the way she no longer met his eyes. He noticed the way she flinched when the wagon rattled past a group of women in town. He went to the mercantile for feed and salt licks. As he was loading the sacks, one of the men who loafed on the bench outside made a sly comment. Here you got yourself some warm company for the winter, Foley. A real armful from what I hear. Tate stopped what he was doing. He turned slowly and fixed the man with a look. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His eyes, flat and cold as river stones, held the man's gaze. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. The man's smirk faltered. He shuffled his feet, looked away, and muttered something about the weather. Tate held the stare for a moment longer, a silent assertion of a boundary crossed, before turning back to his work. He drove home with a muscle working in his jaw. He found Lavinia on her hands and knees, scrubbing the kitchen floor with a fury that was part grief, part rage. The clean pine already shone, but she scrubbed on, trying to scour away the stain of the town's judgment. He walked over and put his hand over hers, stilling the motion of the scrub brush. She froze, her head bowed. "The floor is clean, Lavinia," he said. His voice was a shock. It was not a word, but a sound, a rough, gravelly rasp, torn from a throat long unused. It was raw, painful, and utterly compelling. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock. He was crouched beside her, his face level with hers. He didn't need the slate. He didn't need any more words. His expression, fierce and protective, said everything. "I don't believe them. I'm not letting you go." In that moment, kneeling on the floor of his kitchen, Lavinia felt something shift inside her. A tiny, hopeful crack in the wall she had so carefully built. It was market day again, a month later. The memory of the last time lay between them like a shadow. Lavinia needed flour and yeast, but the thought of facing the town, of running the gauntlet of judging eyes, made her stomach clench. She would make do, she told herself. They could eat potatoes for another week. She was taking the laundry from the line when Tate came to stand beside her. He held up the slate. "We need flour." It wasn't a question. I can wait," she stammered. He shook his head, his expression resolute. He wiped the slate and wrote again. "I'm going with you." A knot of fear and something else, a fragile, burgeoning hope, tightened in her chest. He hitched the wagon, and she climbed up beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. The ride into town was a silent battle inside her. As they pulled onto Main Street, she saw them. Martha Gable and her two cronies, positioned like vultures near the entrance to the general store. They saw the wagon. They saw her. Martha's face hardened into a mask of righteous indignation. She was going to make a stand. Lavinia's breath caught. "Maybe we can come back tomorrow," she whispered. Tate didn't answer. He pulled the wagon to a halt directly in front of the store. He wrapped the reins around the brake handle and sat there for a moment, his gaze fixed forward. Then he turned to her. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We do this together." Steeling herself, Lavinia climbed down from the wagon. As her feet touched the ground, Martha stepped forward, blocking her path. "Well, look who's showing her face," Martha said, her voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Still eating for two, I see. A woman of your size has no shame." She directed her next words past Lavinia, to Tate, who was still on the wagon seat. "Mr. Foley, you are a good man, but you are blind. This woman is a blight on our town, and a danger to your children's morals." Lavinia froze, the public humiliation washing over her, as sharp and cold as the first time. The street had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. She felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear. But this time, she was not alone. With a quiet grace that belied his size, Tate Foley stepped down from the wagon. He didn't go for his slate. He didn't look at Martha. He walked past her as if she were a stone in the road and came to stand not beside Lavinia, but a half step in front of her, a shield between her and the world. The sheer, unmovable fact of his presence silenced Martha's next words. He turned his back on the gawking crowd, on Martha, on all of it. He looked only at Lavinia. The noise of the street, The world fell away. There was only his gaze, steady and sure. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. It was not the slate he pulled out. It was a small, rumpled object. A child's mitten, half-knitted, from the rocking chair. The sacred object. He held it in his calloused palm. Then he opened his mouth. The sound that came out was rough, scraped raw from 4 years of silence. But it was the clearest thing Lavinia had ever heard. Lavinia, her name. Just her name. It was a thunderclap in the silent street. It was a claim. He took a breath, his gaze never leaving hers. He spoke again, his voice softer now, meant only for her, though the whole town strained to hear it. The house is not a home without you. The children, I, am not whole without you. Marry me. He did not get down on one knee. He did not offer a ring. He offered the mitten, the symbol of all his grief and all his hope. He offered her a place, not as a housekeeper, but as the center of his world. Tears she hadn't shed under all the mockery now welled in her eyes. She looked from the unfinished mitten in his hand to the fierce, tender hope in his eyes. And in the middle of Main Street, with the entire town as their witness, she gave him her answer. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Tate, they were married 3 days later on the steps of the small church. It was a simple ceremony, with the parson speaking words of union over 2 people who had already forged one. More people attended than Lavinia would have expected. The story of Tate Foley finding his voice to claim his bride had swept through the town, silencing the gossip with the force of a fable. Neighbors who had previously been cool now offered quiet congratulations. Even the parson's wife gave Lavinia a tight, but not unkind, smile. Martha Gable was not there. Her silence was the closest thing to an apology the town would ever offer. Sam stood beside his father, stiff and proud in a clean shirt, and Lily stood beside Lavinia, clutching her hand and a fistful of late-season daisies. Seasons turned. Winter arrived in earnest, blanketing the high country in a deep, silent white. But inside the Foley house, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire roaring in the hearth. The house had learned to exhale. The rocking chair in the corner was no longer a shrine. Lavinia sat there now in the evenings, the rhythm of the runners a soft, steady heartbeat in the room. The half-finished knitting had been carefully packed away in a cedar chest, a memory honored and then put to rest. In its place, Lavinia rocked Lily, humming a soft tune as the child drifted to sleep. Lavinia's own mending basket had found its permanent home on the hearth. Its contents, spools of thread, scraps of fabric, Tate's socks, Sam's trousers, spilling out in a comfortable, domestic disarray. It was not the tidy, portable basket of a woman ready to leave at a moment's notice. It was the basket of a woman who was here to stay. Tate's voice, once a painful rasp, was slowly gaining its strength. He would never be a talkative man. His nature was too quiet for that. But he no longer lived in a world of silence. He spoke to the children, his words soft and measured. He spoke to the horses. And he spoke to Lavinia. He would come in from the cold, stamping the snow from his boots, and tell her about a fox's track he'd seen, or a fence line that needed checking come spring. She would listen, her hands busy with bread dough or a sewing needle, and the simple sharing of his day was a kind of poetry. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, he came and stood behind her chair. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch familiar and grounding. She leaned her head back against him. Sam was asleep in his bed. Lily was a warm weight in her arms. The firelight danced across the room, catching the shine of the polished floor she no longer scrubbed with fury. She looked around at the small, warm space, at the life she had built, that they had built together. She was no longer just useful. She was not a temporary arrangement, a port in a storm. She was Lavinia Foley, the woman who had arrived in redemption with nothing but a mending basket and a spine of steel now possessed everything that mattered. She was, finally and completely, home.